The scent of bleach and old wax was heavy and sickening, coating the sterile air of Eleanor Vance's mansion. I stood framed in the archway of the kitchen, hands clenched deep inside my pockets, watching my daughter Jenna scrub the marble floor. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat, and her knuckles were white against the industrial brush. She was pregnant, due in 3 weeks, and she was crying silently while she worked. I knew immediately I had to stop her, but the immediate, crushing weight of Eleanor's power, and my own fatal flaw, avoidance, locked my feet to the pristine tile. "Stop scrubbing the floor, Jenna," I heard myself say, the words too quiet, laced with pleading. I took a step forward, the expensive leather of my shoes squeaking faintly against the polished surface. This wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between immediate, agonizing confrontation and the guaranteed destruction of my daughter's spirit. The sound of Eleanor's Italian loafers clicking across the hallway was my final cue. Eleanor, Jenna's mother-in-law, appeared beside me, a silhouette of tailored silk and cold precision. She didn't look at Jenna. Her gaze was fixed on me, perfectly flat. "She isn't finished yet, Mark," Eleanor said, her voice a soft, cultured poison. "The grout line is still uneven near the baseboard. Standards must be maintained." I felt the familiar heat of rage rise in my chest, a sensation I had spent 50 years successfully suppressing in favor of compromise. But I couldn't compromise this. Not when Jenna's breathing sounded ragged and desperate. Eleanor gave me the final, crushing blow. "The papers are signed. We leave for the estate in Maine in 72 hours. She needs to learn discipline before the move." Eleanor's smile never touched her eyes, did it? It was a mask of social grace covering a profound emptiness. The clock had started. If I didn't act now, she would take my daughter entirely out of reach. I felt the muscle jump in my jaw. Eleanor had won the immediate battle by merely existing. My internal voice, the one that preached peace over conflict, screamed at me to back down, to find a legal angle later. I retreated 2 steps, putting the cold, sharp glint of a stainless steel appliance between myself and Eleanor's gaze, adhering to my lifelong policy of tactical withdrawal. The air in this house, deep in suburban Connecticut, was always too cold, temperature controlled to an artificial chill that matched its owner, making the sweat on Jenna's brow seem unnatural. Jenna stopped scrubbing, clutching her enormous stomach. She looked at me, a silent plea replacing the tears. That look, that betrayal of expectation, was the true price of my history of avoidance. I hadn't stood up to her over the oppressive wedding planning, nor when Eleanor insisted on managing the entire pregnancy schedule. Each time I had compromised for the greater good of harmony, I had been a coward. Each avoidance had been a brick in Jenna's gilded cage. It's chilling to realize how many small battles you lose before you realize you forfeited the entire war. "She needs water, Eleanor," I managed, my voice strained but carefully neutral, trying to frame the demand as a maintenance issue rather than an act of defiance. Avoidance, even now, dictated my negotiation strategy. Eleanor merely arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "The water cooler is through the pantry. If she's thirsty, she can finish her task and then retrieve it herself. Discipline, Mark. We are preparing her for the responsibilities of the Vance name, here in the United States." The gentle thud of Jenna's brush hitting the floor as she resumed work was the sound of my failure. I knew I couldn't beat Eleanor in this open arena of passive cruelty. My decades of corporate compromise had dulled my edge for raw, emotional combat. I needed information, not confrontation. I turned, my retreat echoing my usual strategy. But this time, the avoidance was temporary. I had 70 hours left. I had to find leverage before they left the jurisdiction of New England. My immediate action was to leverage my connections, a skill set honed by my career in finance across the states. I drove my rental car away from the sterile perfection of the Vance estate in Westport, Connecticut, and headed north toward New Haven, the windows down despite the autumnal chill, inhaling the damp scent of fallen leaves and distant salt water. This was the air of freedom, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic atmosphere I'd just left. My goal: find something legally binding that Eleanor had hidden, something that explained the sudden, accelerated trip to Maine, scheduled for less than 70 hours from now. I called Detective Robert Hayes, an old college acquaintance now working in organized crime investigations. I explained the situation vaguely, a custody issue involving a wealthy, controlling mother-in-law, omitting the embarrassing details of the floor scrubbing. My avoidance manifested as sanitization, refusing to admit the true depths of Jenna's distress. "Mark, the Vances are old money. They're Teflon." Hayes's voice crackled over the speakerphone, a deep, weary bass. "They operate within the letter of the law, but their execution is pure psychological warfare. If the baby is almost here, They're probably trying to establish residency in a state with favorable grandparent rights. Maine is tricky. It always seems like the law protects those who can afford to twist it into knots, doesn't it? Hayes agreed to run background checks on Eleanor's business associates, specifically the shadowy trust funds mentioned in the prenuptial agreement that I had foolishly allowed Jenna to sign without proper independent review. A prior critical instance of my avoidance. He warned me that accessing the Vance records would be a slow, bureaucratic crawl, taking at least 48 hours. I didn't have 48 hours to waste. The pressure of the deadline, 68 hours, was a physical tightening in my chest. The first step was complete. Identify the lock. The next was to find the specific, practical key. I drove into New Haven, pulling up to the dusty office of my estranged corporate lawyer, hoping to force an immediate search of the legal paperwork I'd neglected. The challenge of competence came from Arthur Finch, the attorney whose help I needed. Arthur, a man whose skin smelled permanently of stale coffee and expensive paper, was reluctant. He shuffled through a disorganized stack of files, the sound a dry whisper in the quiet room. "Mark, you dismissed my concerns about the Vance prenuptial 2 years ago. Said it was easier to keep the peace." He didn't look up, the accusation heavy and unavoidable. "Now you want me to dedicate my resources to finding a loophole in the Iron Lady's contract? The retainer alone will be astronomical." This was obstacle 1, a challenge of practical competence, directly stemming from my past avoidance. I needed him to locate the original trust documents tied to the Maine estate, the documents that Eleanor had used to justify the move. If I could prove the property wasn't legally hers yet, I might stall the 65-hour deadline. I slid my watch, a vintage Rolex, a gift from my retirement celebration, across the worn mahogany desk. "Keep the watch. Start the clock. I need you to find the deed transfer schedule for the Acadia Trust by midnight tonight." The cold metal clinked against the wood. Arthur picked it up, weighing it in his hand. He inhaled deeply, the strong scent of burnt coffee beans momentarily masking the dust of the office. "The Acadia Trust is managed by offshore intermediaries. This is not a Connecticut standard operation, Mark. This requires digging into the deep web of the American finance system," Arthur warned, setting the Rolex down near his massive, humming computer tower. He began typing, the heavy clack of his mechanical keyboard filling the silence. I sat back, running my hand over the bumpy texture of the office chair's aged vinyl. The irony of using wealth to fight against wealth is always sharp, isn't it? The clock was now under 64 hours, and I was relying on the expertise I had previously dismissed to undo the damage my desire for peace had wrought. The truth was buried in a mountain of bureaucratic paperwork, somewhere between the United States and the Cayman Islands. The evening wore on, the frantic rhythm of Arthur's typing a relentless soundtrack. While he burrowed into the digital labyrinth of the Vance family's finances, I tried to reach Jenna, my stomach twisting with the scent of cheap takeout Chinese I'd ordered. Eleanor intercepted every call. "Mark, she's resting. Doctor's orders," Eleanor purred over the phone, the underlying threat undisguised. "If you continue to harass us, I will involve the authorities regarding breach of privacy. I trust you recall the clause in the prenuptial regarding familial cooperation?" I recalled it perfectly. A clause designed to punish any dissent with ruinous legal fees. My old strategy of avoidance whispered to me, "Stop, wait, find a safer way." But the image of Jenna on her knees, her belly huge, scrubbing the floor, silenced that whisper. I refused to back down again. How quickly the desire for comfort can morph into a chain holding you captive, especially in family matters. I hung up, my hands trembling slightly, noticing the faint, acrid smell of ozone coming from Arthur's overheated computer. "Find anything?" I asked, my voice tight. Arthur pushed back from the desk, his face grim. "The Acadia Trust transfer is scheduled for 48 hours from now, less than 16 hours before they leave Connecticut. But I found something else. Something odd. A second transfer dated 6 months ago involving a smaller related trust, the Juniper Annex. It was marked pending review by a local bank in Maine." He tapped the screen, displaying a scan of a handwritten note with Eleanor's familiar, precise looping script. The texture of the digital paper seemed almost tangible. "What's odd about it?" I asked, leaning closer, my ear near the low, persistent whir of the desktop fan. "The annex is for guardianship, not property, and it specifically names the child as the recipient, managed by Eleanor and a co-trustee, bypassing Jenna entirely. The bank refused to process it unless the co-trustee provided a certified death certificate. The co-trustee is listed as DM. I froze. DM was David Miller, my former business partner, who had died in a boating accident 5 years ago. This went beyond financial manipulation. This was a dark, calculated attempt to secure legal control the moment the child drew breath, using the ghost of a dead man. The deadline now felt impossibly short, 60 hours remaining. The revelation that Eleanor was using a dead man's name to establish guardianship brought me face to face with obstacle 2, a moral dilemma and sacrifice. To stop the transfer and prevent the 58-hour move, I needed proof that Eleanor forged David Miller's involvement, but David's widow, Sarah, was notoriously unstable and fiercely protective of her husband's memory. Approaching her meant reopening 5-year-old wounds and sacrificing my own peace for the truth. I found Sarah Miller living in a modest ranch house in suburban Massachusetts, a stark contrast to the Vance opulence. The scent of pine needles and old fireplace smoke greeted me as I knocked. When Sarah opened the door, her eyes, puffy and raw, confirmed the depth of her lingering grief. "Mark, I haven't heard from you since the funeral," she said, her voice thin, brittle as glass. The texture of the worn velvet curtain hanging in the hallway looked like something kept only for nostalgia. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I showed her the Juniper Annex document, detailing the inclusion of DM as co-trustee, requiring his signature or death certificate. Did David ever sign any financial documents involving the Vance family? Sarah's face crumpled. She gripped the wooden doorframe, her knuckles white. He hated the Vances, said they were sharks. He'd never sign anything with them. Then, she looked down. Wait, about 6 months ago, right before I sold his boat, Eleanor's lawyer contacted me. Said David had an old, unfinished partnership agreement he needed to sign off on retroactively, related to some minor investment in the United States Treasury bonds. They needed my signature, too, to release liability. Reversion 1 landed with a painful thud. What I believed was direct forgery might be indirect manipulation. "Did you sign the paperwork, Sarah?" She nodded, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Yes, it was a stack of papers. They stressed how important it was to close the book on David's affairs. I thought I was helping him find peace. The sound of the pen scratching felt like closure. We often mistake manipulation for expediency, especially when we are grieving, don't we? Eleanor hadn't forged David's name. She had buried a guardianship clause inside a stack of innocuous financial paperwork and leveraged Sarah's grief to get the necessary sign-off. My failure to act sooner, my avoidance of conflict with Eleanor, had now ensnared an innocent widow. The consequences of Reversion 1 were immediate and desperate. Eleanor had a legitimate, albeit fraudulently obtained, signature on the trust documents, tying Jenna's unborn child directly to the Vance dynasty, under the guise of an investment partnership cleanup. This meant the Juniper Annex was far stronger than a simple forgery. I sat in Sarah's quiet living room, the memory of her heartbroken confession lingering like the stale smoke. I had 55 hours left until Jenna was relocated, and likely subjected to an emergency C-section orchestrated by the Vances to secure custody under the new guardianship agreement. I called Arthur, detailing the new information. She didn't forge it. She buried the clause. We need to invalidate the entire partnership agreement based on fraud and undue influence over Sarah Miller. Arthur's sigh was loud enough to hear through the phone. That is a civil suit that will take months, Mark. We don't have that time. The bank in Maine will process the annex once the Acadia Trust transfers, and that happens in 40 hours. Your only immediate leverage is stopping the Acadia transfer itself. Isn't it terrifying how the rich can make legal systems move at the speed of their convenience? I knew I couldn't fight Eleanor's legal team in court on a standard fraud claim. I had to find a physical pressure point. I realized my avoidance had created an immediate opening for Eleanor, but my desperation now forced me to adopt Eleanor's tactics, finding the weakness and exploiting it with speed. I remembered Hayes mentioning something about the Vances being Teflon, but only within the letter of the law. I needed to push them outside the letter. I decided to use the one weapon Eleanor couldn't tolerate: public exposure and disgrace. I drove back toward Connecticut, aiming for the Vance headquarters. The scent of Sarah's vulnerability fueled my resolve, forcing me past my inherent need for harmony. The path to superation and growth demanded I discard avoidance and embrace confrontation. I returned to the Vance compound, not to argue with Eleanor, but to break the illusion of control she maintained over her business. I pulled up to the gate, the brass security box gleaming in the weak morning sun, and deliberately keyed in the wrong code 3 times, triggering the security alarm. The siren's high-pitched, piercing sound cut through the suburban quiet of the wealthy neighborhood in the heart of the United States. Eleanor herself answered the security intercom, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Mark, you are trespassing. I advise you to leave immediately. I spoke clearly into the box, imagining the sound traveling through the sterile mansion, potentially reaching Jenna. I am here about the Juniper Annex, Eleanor. I spoke to Sarah Miller. I know you used David's death to secure guardianship of my grandchild through fraud. I have copies of the documents, and I have a journalist waiting for my call. A beat of silence stretched, thick as molasses. Then, the gate motor whirred open, slower than usual. The sound of the alarm was cut abruptly, replaced by a tense quiet. I tasted the metallic air of high tension. Eleanor had succumbed to the threat of scandal. Her reputation was the single thing she would not risk. It's always comforting to know that even the most powerful people have a weakness they guard obsessively, isn't it? I drove onto the property, the gravel crunching under the tires. Eleanor stood on the porch, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face a mask of cold fury. I stepped out of the car, feeling the brittle crunch of the morning frost beneath my feet. I had overcome my initial desire to flee. I was standing my ground, but the fatal flaw of avoidance hadn't vanished. It had simply morphed into recklessness. I was acting on pure, unfiltered adrenaline, without a tangible plan for victory, only for the fight. Obstacle 3. The crisis maxima arrived the moment I stepped into Eleanor's foyer. The air was thick with the overpowering, cloying scent of fresh lilies. You think you can threaten me, Mark? Eleanor hissed, her voice low and venomous. You think your little journalist will stop the Acadia Trust transfer in 32 hours? Or prevent Jenna from needing immediate medical attention? She motioned toward the living room. Jenna was there, slumped in a velvet armchair, her hands clasped over her belly, her breath catching in shallow gasps. She was clearly in distress. Jenna went into preterm labor half an hour ago, Eleanor stated, her tone detached, clinical. The doctor advised we stabilize her, but the stress of your aggressive behavior is exacerbating the contractions. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the loss caused by my reckoning. My reckless confrontation, born from a lifetime of avoidance, had created the exact high-stress environment that jeopardized Jenna and the baby. I hadn't prepared a safe exit. I had only prepared a fight. We leave for the specialized hospital in Maine in 2 hours, Mark, Eleanor said, delivering the crushing blow, her hand resting delicately on Jenna's shoulder. Jenna flinched away from the touch, her eyes wide with fear, focusing on me. If you try to stop the transport, I will inform the paramedics that you are an unstable aggressor, legally interfering with a critical medical evacuation. And you know how the authorities in the United States treat family disputes that interfere with emergency services. The most effective weapon against a moral person is exploiting their morality, isn't it? The heavy scent of the lilies suddenly felt like the suffocating weight of a coffin lid. Eleanor didn't need to win the legal battle yet. She only needed to move Jenna across state lines while she was incapacitated. My daughter was in pain, and my ill-timed aggression had put her in the passenger seat of Eleanor's final power move. I had 2 hours. My failure to plan for this level of escalation had cost me everything. The sight of Jenna clutching her abdomen, pale and terrified, snapped the remnants of my avoidance strategy forever. The night dark of the soul wasn't a philosophical realization. It was a physical shift. My trembling hands stopped. My breath evened out. I saw the situation with a cold, clear precision that years of corporate negotiation had prepared me for, stripped now of the desire for compromise. Eleanor was playing a game of chicken with Jenna's health. My avoidance had led to this reckless move, but now only absolute focus and self-sacrifice could fix it. I swallowed, forcing down the acidic taste of fear. The rough texture of the velvet chair Jenna sat in seemed to absorb all sound. Eleanor, I said, my voice now steady, devoid of plea or threat. If Jenna leaves the state under duress while in labor and anything happens to her or the child, the investigation into the Juniper Annex fraud will become a high-profile felony case, not a civil dispute. You will be accused of endangering my daughter to secure guardianship. I took out my phone. I will not call a journalist. I will call Detective Hayes. I will file an immediate restraining order and felony complaint based on the fraudulent signature. And I will tell the local paramedics that I suspect you are attempting to kidnap a patient in labor. You want to preserve your reputation in the United States? You need to keep me silent. The leverage wasn't legal. It was social. The Vances could buy the law, but they couldn't buy silence from the media. Eleanor's facade finally cracked. Her lips drew into a thin, white line. She couldn't risk a police confrontation at the height of a medical crisis, especially not one involving the death of a former associate. The sound of her sharp intake of breath was the sound of a cornered predator. The internal shift was complete. I was no longer seeking harmony. I was seeking leverage at any cost. The climax centered on a frantic negotiation conducted under the ticking clock of Jenna's contractions, which were now coming every 7 minutes. I had less than 90 minutes before Eleanor's medical transport arrived. "What do you want, Mark?" Eleanor spat, crossing the room to stand directly in front of me, her perfume a suffocating cloud. "I want the Juniper Annex agreement revoked immediately. And I want Jenna taken to Norwalk Hospital, not Maine. And I want assurances, notarized in front of a lawyer, that you will not interfere with Jenna's medical decisions or living arrangements for the first 6 months after the birth." Eleanor laughed, a dry, grating sound. "You ask for my entire leverage and my silence? Impossible." I held my phone up, showing her the contact screen for Hayes. "I'm not asking for peace, Eleanor. I'm giving you a deal to save face. You back off, or I trigger a federal fraud investigation that will tank your company's valuation before the opening bell. You have 30 minutes to call your lawyer and execute the revocation documents." The immediate sound of a car pulling up the driveway, the paramedic transport, ratcheted the tension. The smell of disinfectant suddenly mingled with the lilies. Jenna cried out, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through my hardened resolve. I rushed to her side, kneeling, resting my hand on her hot forehead. Her skin was damp, soft beneath my palm. Eleanor watched us, her expression calculating. She knew I wouldn't call Hayes if it risked Jenna. This was the razor's edge. My compassion against her ruthlessness. Isn't it amazing how the sound of a loved one's pain can be the only force capable of moving mountains? She retreated to her office, calling her lawyer, the hurried whispers confirming her surrender to the threat of public scandal in the tight-knit financial circles of the United States. She was securing the revocation, but I knew she was planning her next move. The moment the document was signed, the climax would reach its breaking point. Eleanor emerged 20 minutes later, holding a faxed document, the full, unconditional revocation of the Juniper Annex, signed by her and her attorney. She thrust it into my hands. The smooth, cold texture of the fax paper felt like a temporary truce. "The agreement is rescinded. Now, my transport takes Jenna to Maine," Eleanor declared, her eyes blazing. "Norwalk Hospital, not Maine," I countered, standing firm. "The transport is already paid for and routed. Cancel it. Or I make the call," I interrupted, raising my phone. Eleanor glared, then abruptly nodded toward the waiting paramedics. "Norwalk. But you will not set foot on this property again, Mark." Jenna was loaded into the ambulance, and I rode beside her, my focus entirely on her rhythmic breathing, the persistent smell of sterile linens filling the small space. Just as the ambulance pulled onto the main street, Jenna gripped my hand, hard. "Dad," she whispered, her voice strained. "It wasn't just Eleanor. My husband, David Jr., he signed the documents too. He initiated the partnership agreement with his mother." Reversion 2 hit like a physical blow. The villain wasn't just the mother-in-law. It was the son, the man Jenna loved. I had spent all my energy fighting Eleanor's manipulation, convinced she was the sole puppet master, and blinded by my desperate need to resolve the conflict without implicating Jenna's husband, an ultimate act of avoidance. Jenna's husband hadn't been an innocent bystander. He was an active conspirator, hoping to leverage his inheritance via the control of his child. How often do we focus on the visible threat and ignore the quieter, more intimate betrayal? I looked at Jenna, who was already slipping back into the pain, and realized the resolution I sought would destroy her family. But now, it was too late to back down. The avoidance was dead, replaced by a grim clarity. Jenna gave birth to a healthy baby girl in Norwalk Hospital 3 hours later. The clock had run out, the deadline vanquished. I held my granddaughter, feeling the soft, fragile texture of her skin against my calloused hand, inhaling the sweet, powdery scent of new life. Victory. Jenna was safe, and the guardianship agreement was void. But the cost was immediate and permanent. Upon hearing the news of the annulled annex and the hospital choice, David Jr. refused to visit, demanding to know why I had interfered with his mother's carefully laid plans. When I revealed the depth of his involvement in the fraudulent guardianship, Jenna, exhausted and betrayed, made her choice. She filed for immediate separation. The marriage was permanently fractured. The legal fallout from my aggressive negotiation hit quickly. Eleanor, true to her nature, initiated a massive civil suit against me for emotional distress, corporate interference, and defamation, a clear attempt to bankrupt me and ruin my reputation across the financial community in the United States. I lost the retirement fund I had worked decades to accumulate, paying Arthur's escalating fees to fight the endless retaliatory litigation. I stood beside Jenna as she nursed the baby, whose tiny fist curled tightly around my finger. I had saved my daughter and granddaughter from the gilded cage, achieving the victory I was too afraid to fight for initially. But the expense of abandoning my avoidance had left me financially devastated and socially isolated. Jenna had her freedom, but she had lost her marriage, and I had lost my future comfort. Sometimes the truest form of love requires you to burn your own ship to save the other person's. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the faint, comforting smell of the hospital's clean laundry, a backdrop to the bittersweet reality. I had paid the price for my lifelong flaw.